Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. My name is Daniel Crawford, and I own a 5-acre property at the edge of Maple Ridge Estates. It's technically within the HOA boundaries, but my land was grandfathered in with special exemptions when the development expanded 10 years ago. My family has owned this land for 3 generations, and the centerpiece of the property is a beautifully restored barn that my grandfather built with his own hands in the 1950s. Karen Whitfield moved into Maple Ridge Estates 2 years ago and immediately ran for HOA president. Nobody else wanted the job, so she won by default. From day one, she's been on a mission to improve community standards, which really means imposing her will on everyone else. She's in her mid-40s with that signature highlighted bob haircut that somehow perfectly matches her personality. Sharp, angular, and artificially enhanced. Karen wears designer outfits to check mailboxes and drives a white Range Rover with a personalized license plate that reads BSW. Our first encounter happened when she tried to fine me for having agricultural structures in a residential zone. I simply produced my property exemption documents, and she was forced to back down. The look on her face, a mixture of shock and indignation, told me I'd made an enemy for life. Since then, she's been looking for any excuse to assert her authority over my property. I work as an environmental lawyer, which means I know exactly how to navigate bureaucratic nightmares like Karen. My job requires patience, attention to detail, and the ability to remain calm while others lose their composure. These skills have served me well in my ongoing Cold War with Karen Whitfield, HOA President Extraordinaire. You know, I've faced off against multinational corporations trying to dump toxic waste in protected wetlands, but somehow Karen Whitfield proved to be my most persistent adversary. I also have 3 very special companions, my Bavarian Mountain Hounds. They're tracking dogs originally bred in Germany with keen senses and impressive training. Hansel, Gretel, and Bruno are gentle giants who wouldn't hurt a fly, but they look intimidating with their muscular bodies and deep, resonant barks. They're well-trained and respond to both verbal commands and a special whistle I use. They're my family, and we spend weekends hiking the trails behind my property. The trouble began on a Saturday in June. I was returning from a business trip, having spent 3 days in Seattle negotiating an environmental settlement. As I drove down the long driveway to my home, I noticed something strange. Dozens of cars parked along my private drive and spilling onto the grass. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating from travel fatigue. Then I saw it. My barn transformed into what could only be described as a wedding venue. White chairs were arranged in neat rows facing an improvised altar. Fairy lights were strung across the rafters that my grandfather had installed decades ago. A portable. The dance floor had been laid over the antique wooden planks, and people, at least 100 guests in formal attire, were milling about my property, drinking champagne and taking photos against my barn. For a few seconds, I sat in my car, mouth agape, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I somehow forgotten renting out my property? Had I entered an alternate dimension where strangers could use private property without permission? Then I spotted her. Karen, wearing a pale blue dress and directing caterers with the enthusiasm of a field marshal commanding troops. I parked my car and walked toward the barn, maintaining a calm exterior while my blood pressure soared to dangerous levels. As I approached, Karen spotted me, and her eyes widened momentarily before she regained her composure and marched toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest. "Daniel, you're back early," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I tried to reach you, but you must have been busy." "Karen," I replied evenly, "what exactly is happening on my property right now?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it's Jessica's daughter's wedding. You know Jessica from Maple Court? The poor thing's venue canceled due to last-minute flooding or some nonsense. As HOA president, I had to step in and help a community member in need. I looked around at the elaborate setup, and you chose my barn without asking me." Karen's smile never faltered. "Well, your property is part of Maple Ridge Estates, and as president, I have emergency authorization powers for community needs. It's in the bylaws. She patted her clipboard. I have the paperwork right here. The HOA is providing liability coverage, of course. This was a blatant lie. I knew the bylaws inside and out, and there was no such provision. More importantly, my property exemptions specifically stated that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land use. Karen was counting on me not causing a scene in the middle of some innocent bride's wedding. In a controlled, slightly ironic tone, I said, I've spent my career reading fine print and catching people in lies about regulations. Did Karen really think I wouldn't know my own property rights? I looked past Karen to see a young woman in a wedding dress, radiant and happy, posing for pictures with who I assumed was her new husband. They were standing in front of the hand-carved wooden doors that my father had restored this summer before he passed away. I felt a pang of both sympathy and anger. This couple was innocent in Karen's scheme, but this was still a massive violation. Karen, there is no such provision in the bylaws. You know that. I'm going to speak to the bride and explain the situation. Karen's smile vanished, replaced by panic. She grabbed my arm. You can't. Everything's perfect. They'll be gone by 10, and I'll have a cleaning crew here tomorrow. No one needs to know there was a misunderstanding. I carefully removed her hand from my sleeve. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is trespassing and unauthorized. You've put this couple in an awful position. As I walked toward the bride, Karen hissed behind me. I'll have you fined for violating HOA landscaping regulations. Your grass is a 1/4 inch too high on the south slope. I approached the couple and gently explained the situation. The bride looked horrified, and the groom turned an alarming shade of red as he looked over at Karen, who was now pretending to be busy with the caterers. I assured them I wasn't going to shut down their wedding. I'm not a monster, but I needed them to understand what had happened. We had no idea, the bride said, clutching her bouquet. Mrs. Whitfield said she had permission and that you were a close friend who wanted to help. She said you were away and had left her in charge of the property. The groom, now composed but clearly angry, added, she charged us $4,000 for the venue rental and said it was a special rate because we were community members. That was when the full picture came into focus. Karen hadn't just commandeered my property for a community good deed. She had rented it out and pocketed the money. This wasn't just entitlement, it was fraud. I made a quick decision. Your wedding will continue as planned. This is your day, and you shouldn't suffer for someone else's actions. Consider the venue my gift to you. The relief on their faces was palpable, and after they thanked me profusely, I headed back to my house. Karen tried to intercept me, but I simply said, we'll discuss this tomorrow, Karen. Enjoy the party you've thrown with my property. That night, I made several phone calls to my attorney, to the HOA board secretary who had never liked Karen, and to a few other necessary parties. Then I settled in with Hansel, Gretel, and Bruno, reviewing the property bylaws and my exemption documents one more time. Even though I knew them by heart, I wanted to be absolutely certain of my legal standing before tomorrow. The wedding reception continued until just after 10, and I watched from my porch as cars departed and the caterers packed up. Karen supervised the basic cleanup, undoubtedly planning to have a service finished tomorrow, as she had mentioned. She gave my house a wide berth, avoiding eye contact as she directed people off the property. By midnight, everyone was gone except for Karen, who was doing a final walkthrough of my barn with her flashlight. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I was up early, feeding the hounds and preparing for Karen's inevitable visit. She wouldn't be able to resist coming to try to control the narrative. Before I could take action, my security cameras showed her white Range Rover pulling up at precisely 9:37 a.m. Karen had changed tactics overnight. She approached my door with a gift basket containing wine and gourmet chocolates, her face set in a conciliatory smile. I invited her in, maintaining a neutral expression as she launched into her explanation. Daniel, I want to apologize for the miscommunication yesterday. I really did try to reach you, but with the emergency situation, I had to make an executive decision. Jessica's daughter was devastated, and I knew your beautiful barn would save her special day. I sipped my coffee, letting her continue her performance. The donation they gave to the HOA will be used for community improvements that will benefit everyone, including you. I'm thinking new entrance landscaping or perhaps a playground for the children. It's fascinating watching someone try to retroactively justify fraud. Karen called it a donation now, not the $4,000 rental fee I knew she had charged. I set down my cup. Karen, let's be clear. You rented out my property without permission, charged money for it, and lied to an innocent couple. That's fraud, trespassing, and unauthorized use of private property. Her smile faltered. That's a rather harsh interpretation of a simple favor I did for. I interrupted. I spoke to the couple, and I've reviewed my security footage from the past week, which shows you bringing vendors here repeatedly while I was away. This wasn't a spontaneous emergency response. It was planned. Karen's demeanor changed instantly, her eyes narrowing. You're making a big deal out of nothing. My authority as HOA president doesn't extend to my property, as you well know from our previous discussions about my exemptions. She shifted tactics again, her voice taking on a threatening edge. The board won't appreciate you making trouble. We can make home ownership very difficult for problem residents, Daniel. Constant citations, special assessments, approval delays. I smiled for the first time. That sounds remarkably like threatening illegal retaliation, Karen. Would you mind repeating that for clarity? My security system records audio as well as video. Her face flushed, and she stood up. You're twisting my words. I came here in good faith to resolve this amicably. By offering me a gift basket in exchange for ignoring fraud? That's not how this works. Karen moved toward the door. This isn't over, Daniel. You're not as clever as you think. As she reached for the handle, I said calmly, actually, there's one more thing before you go. I reached for my special whistle and gave it 2 short blasts. The effect was immediate and impressive. From 3 different corners of the house came my hounds, their nails clicking on the hardwood as they trotted into the living room. They lined up beside me, 3 massive muscular animals with intelligent eyes fixed on our visitor. Karen froze, her hand still on the doorknob. What are you doing? Introducing you to Hansel, Gretel, and Bruno. They're Bavarian mountain hounds. Tracking dogs. Very smart, very obedient. The dog sat perfectly still, watching Karen with interest but showing no aggression. They weren't trained attack dogs. They were hunting companions, but Karen didn't know that. All she saw were 3 large, powerful animals responding to my commands. From now on, they'll be patrolling my property day and night. They're trained to alert me to trespassers and to track scents across large distances. Just something to keep in mind if you're planning any more events in my barn. Karen's face had gone pale. You're threatening me with dogs? That's against HOA regulations. No aggressive breeds or animals used for intimidation. I raised an eyebrow. Check the bylaws again, Karen. My property exemptions cover animal husbandry and working dogs specifically. These are registered tracking hounds, not restricted breeds, and they're not aggressive unless someone is trespassing on private property. To demonstrate, I gave another whistle command, and all 3 dogs lay down immediately, perfectly calm and controlled. I've also taken the liberty of filing a formal complaint with the HOA board. Not with you, obviously, but with the secretary and treasurer directly. They were quite interested to hear about unauthorized commercial activity being conducted by the president. The emergency board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow evening. Karen's composure finally cracked. You had no right. I'm trying to build a community here, and all you do is hide behind your special exemptions and lawyers. Speaking of lawyers, I continued calmly. Mine has already drafted a cease and desist letter regarding your fraudulent rental of my property. It should be delivered to your home this afternoon. He's also prepared to file a civil suit for the rental fees you collected, plus damages, unless those funds are returned to the couple and a public apology is issued. Karen's hand trembled on the doorknob. You wouldn't dare? The scandal would affect property values. I'm an environmental lawyer, Karen. I take on multinational corporations for a living. Filing a case against an HOA president who committed fraud is a Tuesday morning for me. With that, Karen yanked open the door and stormed out. I gave another whistle, and Hansel, Gretel, and Bruno followed me to the porch, where we watched Karen march to her Range Rover. As she fumbled with her keys, her phone rang. The look on her face as she answered told me everything I needed to know. The board's secretary had already begun making calls. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the Maple Ridge Estates HOA. It contained formal notice that Karen Whitfield had been removed as president, effective immediately, pending investigation of financial improprieties and abuse of authority. The interim president, a retired judge named Walter Simmons, requested a meeting to discuss appropriate compensation for the unauthorized use of my property. I was reading this letter on my porch, Hansel dozing at my feet, when a police cruiser pulled up my driveway. The officer approached and asked if I was Daniel Crawford. When I confirmed, he handed me another document, a restraining order filing from Karen Whitfield, claiming I had threatened her with attack dogs and intimidation. I couldn't help but laugh, which the officer clearly found inappropriate, until I showed him my security footage from that morning. Karen had apparently come onto my property at dawn, before I was awake, and staged photos of herself looking threatened by my hounds, who were clearly behind my fence and merely watching her curiously as she trespassed. Again, the officer shook his head after viewing the footage. "Sir, would you like to file a trespassing complaint? This video clearly shows her entering your property without permission, and given the ongoing dispute." I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I think that would be appropriate. She needs to understand there are consequences." As the officer wrote up the report, I spotted a familiar white Range Rover slowing down as it passed my driveway. Karen was watching us, probably wondering what we were discussing. I gave a short blast on my whistle, and all 3 hounds appeared on the porch, sitting attentively beside me. Even from a distance, I could see Karen's face through her car window, a perfect mask of outrage and disbelief. As the officer handed me a copy of the trespassing complaint and then waved at her car, clearly recognizing her, she rolled down her window, ready to launch into what would undoubtedly be an epic tirade. When the officer approached her vehicle, he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to speak with you regarding a trespassing complaint and what appears to be filing a false police report. Please step out of the vehicle."